You know, it has been 6 years since we reviewed the original Panasonic S1R, and I would argue that that was really Panasonic's last photo-centric camera. I've been asking for this for a long time, but look at this. 6 years later, we have the Panasonic S1R II. Now, I cannot necessarily guarantee that it is a photo-centric camera, but it is certainly the latest hybrid that they've made. But I'm excited to test the photo features. I know Jordan's excited to play with the video features. We've got 2 production units, so Jordan is shooting this episode 8K on an S1R II right now, so you can be able to see that footage as well. So of course, Panasonic, when it comes to video, they have been world leaders, absolutely. But I have said many times that I feel they're kind of neglecting what photographers are really looking for. The S5 II was a nice camera that brought phase detect hybrid autofocus to the lineup, but at 24 megapixels, it was still more of a general purpose, jack of all trades. But now the S1R II is giving us a 44 megapixel sensor. We're getting more resolution, but is it still gonna please me as a photographer? Is it going to please Jordan as a videographer? I'm Chris Niccolls. This is PetaPixel, and we've got an amazing location for you today. So I'm coming to you in stunning 8K resolution on the S1R II from a very beautiful northern Norwegian town, Tromso. And I mean, beautiful town, really cool stuff. Never been here before. It's actually slightly warmer than back home, so I'm excited to get some shots here, even if the weather could be better. So of course, Panasonic have flown us out here for the launch event, putting us in a hotel, taking really good care of us, and as usual, it is not going to influence what we say about this camera. These are, as I've already mentioned, pre-production cameras, but they are image ready to review, so let's get to it. So it's been 6 years since I played with the original S1R, but I distinctly remember that camera being just physically huge and bulky. This is 20% lighter, but it's also noticeably smaller. I definitely like the new form factor here, very compact, but we still get a nice beefy grip, and it's actually very comfortable to hold. I'm finding everything falling into place really nicely as far as controls go. I also like that both control dials on top have a locking toggle switch. We always appreciate having that, and I get it on both. I also want to mention we've got the locking switch here where this lets us now lock some of the features. So if I don't want the control dials to be working or accidentally turn and change values, I can now customize which ones get locked by the locking switch. That's a really nice feature to have. And even though they've made this body smaller, I still feel like they've done a really good job of laying out the controls here. So I like the AF on button position, autofocusing joystick right below it, autofocus control. I've got the classic white balance, ISO, and exposure compensation on top, and those can be customized. I am losing some features. I mean, we don't get an LCD panel on top. I'm fine with that. Instead, we now get a record button on top and also here on the front. And again, I can customize those for something different as well. And that's actually a point I really want to make that's very cool about this. So we do now have a selector switch here on the left that goes between photo, video, and S&Q modes. And whatever customization I do in each of those 3 modes, it remembers it separately. So it's basically like having 3 different custom function settings for the camera. I can go and give this to Jordan, he can shoot video, and it doesn't mess up my settings, and that's gonna be fantastic. The only thing that I feel is kind of missing from the S1R that I am actually going to miss is the illuminated buttons. If I'm shooting at night, it was really nice to have those illuminated buttons, but sadly we don't have it on this camera. Actually, there's a lot of changes to this camera that I really have to point out here. So the on-off switch, it's a different design than I've seen before. I don't find it very easy to reach up with my right thumb here and click it on and off. I can do it, but it's uncomfortable. I'm finding that I'm actually using my left hand to click it on and off. That's not very intuitive, but maybe it'll get better as I practice more with it. I do appreciate the tally lamps. This is something that drives me crazy on the S5 II. There's no tally lamp, so if Jordan accidentally double taps on a record while I'm doing a talking point, I might be speaking and nothing's rolling. Here, I can clearly see that we've got tally lamps on the front and back. That's a really nice feature to have. The last thing I want to mention here, it's snowing, it's kind of yucky out, but these, of course, are fully weather-sealed bodies. So wandering on Tromso, I'm noticing there's ravens everywhere, and this drives Jordan crazy because if you've watched the show, you might know Jordan hates ravens, and it's completely unreasonable. I mean, they're beautiful and intelligent birds. Even more unreasonable considering that in Norse mythology, Odin, the ruler of Asgard, is associated with ravens. His 2 raven helpers, Hugin and Munin. I mean, this is such an important part of the culture here, and he just really needs to change his attitude. So let's talk about what's behind the lens next, okay? So the first thing you're gonna notice when you take the lens off, there is actually now a carbon fiber cover to block off the sensor when you're changing lenses, for example, you know, to keep dust and grime out of there. Very important on a day like today. It's actually carbon fiber just because it's a little bit more rigid, nice and lightweight, and it won't have any issues if you've got, for example, the lens pointing up at the sky and sunlight going down, focusing on the mechanism. It's not burning out your shutter. The carbon fiber is way more heat resistant. Anyways, what lies under that? It's a sensor that we have not seen in a Panasonic full-frame mirrorless camera before. This is a 44 megapixel non-stacked chip. Now it's backside illuminated, but it's not stacked, and that is interesting because when you look at a lot of the other cameras out right now, the Canon R5 Mark II, the Nikon Z8, these all feature stacked sensors. Fast readout speeds, really good electronic shutter capabilities, minimum rolling shutter issues, but they're quite a bit more expensive. This camera is actually very affordable considering what it gives you, and by having a non-stack sensor, we're getting maximum dynamic range for photography. So we have a dual gain chip here. We're getting 80 as our base ISO, which is gonna be fantastic for dynamic range. Not that we're gonna get to really test that on a day like today, super flat conditions. I think Jordan's complaining his lens is covered in water, it's fogging up. So I don't know, we'll see if we get a better example later on. And then our next step up for our base ISO is 400. Now because this is not a stacked sensor, we're not gonna get the insane 120 FIPS that you would get on some of the other stacked chips. We're limited to 40 frames per second in electronic shutter mode, which is absolutely respectable, but keep in mind we are gonna get a little bit of rolling shutter. This sensor's not really made for electronic shutter shooting, but you know, if we are going to do mechanical shutter, we can get up to 10 frames per second, but I will explain it gets a little bit complicated. So if I'm okay shooting around 6 frames per second, I can get maximum bit depth, I can get autofocus continuous with tracking autofocus, no problem. You know, this is about 6 frames per second right now, but I can push it up to 10 frames per second. Now here's the trick. If I do 10, I'm going to lose a bit of bit depth. I'm going to go down to 12 bit. I'm not going to get any tracking autofocus. I can though select to instead shoot 9 frames per second. I'm still not going to get tracking autofocus, but I will get subject detection continuous autofocus, and I will get 14 bits. And I think 9 frames per second, that's plenty for most situations, so I'm pretty happy with that, but I'm going to be relying on that a lot. So classic Scandinavian weather setting in. It's getting really nasty out, really cold. We're certainly putting the cameras to the weather sealing test. And it's also really dark if you can't tell. I mean, we've got really gray light. So I'm shooting at high ISOs, which is great for tests. I mean, I'm gonna see what this new sensor can do as far as high ISO performance, but it also means that I'm getting my shutter speeds down slower, trying to hand hold. But fortunately, I'm getting up to 8 stops with the dual IS and the IBIS in this body. Right now I'm using the 24-105, so it's actually working in conjunction with that lens. And we're just trying to get as much stability as possible to keep the ISO as slow as possible. So we're actually getting some really nice displays here. We're getting a 5.76 million dot EVF. It's nice and clear, good eye relief, very good magnification. We're also getting a 1.84 million dot LCD panel. This is fully articulating and it tilts, so I like the options that I have here as far as composing an image. Now we're getting the same battery that we have in the Panasonic S1R II series, which is, you know, a smaller capacity than what we had in the S1R. But at the same time, in 6 years, we've seen big changes as far as better processing power with better power efficiency. And so despite the fact that we've got this more powerful EVF, larger screen, you know, higher megapixel sensor, we're essentially getting the same battery life that we could expect on the Panasonic S1R II. So the S1R II modernizes the ports and the doors here on the camera, which is to be expected after 6 years. We used to have this big singular floppy rubber cover here, and it wasn't very good at protecting the camera. I like that we now get separate doors here for the full-size HDMI, for the USB-C, for the mic jack and the headphone jack. And then here we've also got a locking door for our memory cards, CF Express Type B, as well as a UHS-2 SD card slot. Now this is a pre-production camera, so I can't really do like official buffer ratings or anything, but we decided to do a bit of an impromptu test to have some idea of what's going on. If you're shooting 40 frames per second electronic shutter mode, just shooting RAWs, we're gonna fill up the buffer pretty quick. We get about 80 shots. It's gonna fill up in about a second and a half. However, if I go down to even 9 or 10 frames per second with the mechanical shutter, I can basically shoot and shoot and shoot as long as I've got a fast CF Express Type B card. So when Jordan and I are traveling like this, it's a lot to manage our memory cards and storage solutions. I mean, we're bringing CF Express Type Bs, we're bringing SD cards, we're bringing SSDs, and you can output from the S1R II right to an SSD, and then of course transferring files back and forth. So we're testing out a lot of the Lexar cards and Lexar products, and Jordan is going to talk about that next.
Okay, it's Jordan here right after returning from Norway, and I want to talk about my workflow on this episode, as well as a tool that made it a whole lot easier. So when we were in Norway, Chris and I were shooting to Lexar CF Express Type B cards so we could take advantage of the most demanding record modes and have the deepest buffer. After shooting my video tests, I dropped them onto a Lexar Workflow USB-C SSD, a super fast drive that runs at 2,000 megabytes per second, and it's incredibly rugged with an IPX68 rating. Now, upon returning home, I can plug my laptop into the Lexar Professional Workflow Hub with Thunderbolt 4. Plugging in will power my laptop and connect me to my lovely secondary display. But what really rocks about this device is I can now plug in a CF Express B reader and the card, which has all of my A-roll, as well an SD/micro SD reader, which has Chris's processed photo files on it. Then add both my home 2TB SSD, which has all of my PetaPixel assets, as well as my Norway 2TB SSD, which will be my working drive and already has my video tests on it. Just one cable plugged into my computer and I'm ready to cut this entire complex project. That's just my workflow for this one episode, though. The beauty of Lexar's workflow system is you can customize all 6 bays with a variety of different readers and different capacity SSDs that will fit the requirements of any professional photographer or videographer. So click the link in the description below if you want to learn more about Lexar's workflow system, and thank you so much to Lexar for sponsoring this episode. Okay, let's go back to me when I was frozen in Norway talking about the video capabilities of this camera. All right, it's Jordan to talk about the video capabilities of the S1R II, which is filming me right now in glorious 8K using Panasonic's new Cine A profile we're going to talk about a little bit later. Now, the original Panasonic S1R was really a camera built for photographers that was capable of recording video. But I think this is going to be kind of an equal split for users between people who like their art motionless or motion full. And that's because this high-res sensor reads out just a little bit faster than the S5 II, so you're getting a whole lot more resolution compared to that camera without a lot of downsides. Because we've got a 44 megapixel sensor here, this camera is Panasonic's first that is capable of 8K recording, and you can record that in 16:9 or 17:9 aspect ratios. The only annoying thing is this is only possible to record in H.265 10-bit 420, where we have 422 recording in some of the other modes, so that's going to make the footage just a little bit less malleable in post. One of my favorite things about Panasonic cameras is a lot of them offer open gate recording, where it'll just use the entire sensor area and then you can choose your aspect ratios after the fact. Now, this can record open gate, but at 6.4K, which is kind of interesting. I was expecting 8K, but this is giving you the full area of the sensor. And I checked, it's actually oversampled coming off of this. I was asking why 8K isn't available, and Panasonic says it will be coming in a future firmware update, but I'm not sure why it's not available right now. Let's talk about slow motion here. Now, the S1R II can record 60p up to 5.8K. As soon as you do that, it does apply a small, about a 1.1 crop factor to the footage. Now, you can also record 4K up to 120 frames per second, but here we do drop over to a subsampled mode. As a result, detail and noise are going to be significantly worse when you're recording in this. Interestingly, we've got the same maximum frame rate of 120 frames per second in 1080p, even if we move over to the S and Q mode, so I just always record it in 4K. Interestingly, this camera is capable of recording ProRes internally and ProRes RAW right to the memory card, or you can kick it out to the SSD. However, there are some odd limitations with this. 8K is not available in either mode, and open gate recording is not available in ProRes, which seems like an odd oversight to me. Oh man, I am soaking wet. And you know what else is wet? Is Jell-O. So let's talk about rolling shutter on this camera. Now, it is a little bit better than what we saw before on the S5 II, S5 IIX. We've calculated it at around a 50th of a second if you're shooting, the full width of the sensor. So it's actually not bad on that, but you are still going to find, if you're doing whip pans or have fast-moving subjects, there will be some distortion in the video. It's certainly not on par with some of the other cameras like the Z8, R5 II, Sony A1 that have stacked sensors, and that's what you're paying that premium for. Stabilization is one area where Panasonic has really excelled. I was a big fan of the S5 II stabilization, and this has improved even over that. Just using the optical stabilization at 24 millimeters right here, you can see there's some bounce to the footage, but it's very organic, very natural looking. Kick on even the electronic normal stabilization, where it's putting in a little bit of digital stabilization, just looks fantastic on this. And at high, there is a pretty heavy crop, but you can see it basically looks like a gimbal. Now, what's really interesting is they have a new cropless wide angle where it'll actually use the surface area of the sensor that's not recording video generally in order to slightly correct skew. And I really like the look of this. Just be aware, at this point, it's only working with Panasonic lenses, and in some situations you might actually see the hood or things that aren't supposed to be captured in the frame. Sorry, just a quick interruption on this video. I know I look like trash, so you don't have to tell me in the comments that that is the case. Let's talk about audio on this, and that is another area where Panasonic is really killing it. In fact, they had dedicated audio buttons on some of their recent cameras. This one does not offer that, but you can program one of the custom buttons on the camera to bring up their very intuitive audio interface, which works great, and you can make it even better by using the XLR II attachment. This gives you 2 XLRs, a mini phone input, but also unlocks 32-bit float audio. And this is going to give you a lot more flexibility in post over your audio levels. The one thing I would love to see from Panasonic is the ability to record 32-bit float directly into camera without the use of the XLR attachment. They say it's because that XLR attachment has the analog to digital converter, but they might as well just start building it into the cameras going forward. Now, this has Panasonic's full complement of different profiles. You can build custom LUTs using their app, but they do have a new one here, and it's called the Cinelike A2 profile. And they're being a little cagey about exactly where it comes from, but it's been implied to me that basically they're taking the Airy LUT-C that they're using on the GH7 and applying it to their own vlog profile, but giving you basically a graded look straight out of camera. And I actually really like it. I think this might actually replace my beloved Leica 709 profile as my favorite standard profile. So what did I think of shooting with the S1R II? Well, the whole time it really reminded me of basically shooting with a beefed up S5 II, S5 IIX. You've got some more creative options. I really liked having a minor crop when I want to record 4K 60 and having the option of 4K 120, even with the reduced quality on it. And honestly, this is the best camera in the L mount if you want to record video. I could see using this camera to shoot our show all the time, especially when I want a little bit more resolution, but it is still a bit of a downside that I'm still going to want to pull out the GH7 when I want to shoot slow-mo with the minimal loss in quality. And there are some cameras that are maybe more technically capable when it comes to video with stacked sensors. Cameras like the R5 II, the Nikon Z8, but this has some features like open gate and assist tools that we're not going to find in some of those other options. And for that reason, I think it's one of the best video cameras out there, although it definitely leaves room for an S2H or an S1R II that offers a stacked sensor and all of the great video features that we've already seen here. I don't want to talk anymore because I'm soaking wet, and Chris apparently wants me to go shoot on a rainy bridge, and I'm going to follow him because I made terrible career decisions. Oh, you thought you were gonna see Chris after that montage. No. Because in my soggy delirium last night, I forgot there's still some video stuff that I really need to talk about. Starting with the new Lumix Flow app for your smartphone. Now this is really designed so that you can kind of take your video from conception to scripting, and it'll even let you do some file organization before you start editing, but that's totally outside the scope of this video. What's really cool in this is it gives you the option to use your smartphone when connected with a USB cable as an external monitor. So you're now getting a very sharp, very bright monitor, and because it's connected directly, I was really impressed there's not a lot of lag when you're using this monitoring tool. The downside to it is still quite limited in terms of some of its functionality. You're not getting waveforms, the D-squeeze functionality is not available, but you can still use your flip-out LCD for all of that, and then just use this basically as a focusing aid, and in that regard it actually works really well. An interesting aspect to this sensor is if you're recording in Vlog, it's going to give you an option called dynamic range expansion. And as I already said, we're reading out this sensor at around a 50th of a second in video mode. This will actually slow things down to closer to a 30th, but the advantage here is we're going to get more highlight information. So typically our base ISO is 200 and 1000 when we're in Vlog. Switch this over, we're going to go to 400 and 2000, but the advantage is more highlight information. It does mean if you capture all those, you'll get a little more noise in the shadows, but if you need a little more DR and you're willing to sacrifice some rolling shutter performance, it's great to have this option. Okay, now I'm serious. I am actually throwing over to Chris, who's going to talk about image quality on this camera.
So, we've all been talking, this sensor, it's not something we've seen in a Panasonic camera before. Where does it come from? And it has a lot of similarities to what we would find in something like the DJI Ronin 4D. Could very well be a similar sensor. Regardless, what matters here is we're getting a 44 megapixel sensor and it's not stacked. And I know at first, glance, you're like, don't I want stacked? Don't I want the better, electronic shutter, the less rolling shutter? And to some degree, yes, especially if it's more of a sports and action camera, but I actually think it's quite smart that Panasonic is sticking to a non-stacked sensor here, and here's why. There's a lot of people out there who wanted something like a Nikon Z7 III, something with good resolution, but maximum dynamic range, and it looks like Panasonic has actually jumped on that first. And if you are gonna do landscape, not that we're getting dynamic range pushes today, but if you are in a situation where you want maximum dynamic range, and you want good resolution, and you're planning on using mechanical shutter, this sensor actually makes a lot of sense. So I do really think this sensor is going to shine for people wanting to do landscape work, maybe studio work as well, any sort of travel photography. I think 44 megapixels hits a really nice sweet spot for getting good detail, good resolution, print size without big files. But at the same time, we're actually getting really good low light performance, excellent dynamic range. I think this would be fantastic for studio photography. But actually on that regard, I do want to mention the original S1R had a 320th of a second maximum flash sync. This has dropped down to 250th, still respectable, but I do think that's kind of interesting that we're not getting that. And of course, electronic shutter, we're not doing studio photography with flashes with this electronic shutter at all. So the S1R II can actually shoot 177 megapixel handheld high-res photos. This is a first for a full frame to get that kind of resolution handheld. Granted, I know shooting on the top of a boat is not a good situation for that, so I'm not going to do it here, but you can look at a sample here where we took it on dry land. But yeah, very cool feature that you can do handheld, get more dynamic range, get those extra megapixels. Did you know the Tirpitz was sunk like right here?
What's the Tirpitz?
I don't know, Google it. So this is a pretty normal occurrence in Norway, just to be surrounded by reindeer. especially if you do come to a reindeer camp, I suppose. But it does give us a really good opportunity to test things like the subject detection autofocus here on the S1R II. So this has a new autofocusing system. They're calling it an AI-based phase detect hybrid autofocusing system. And so what we can test here with some of the portraits I've shot, and certainly the animals here, is things like eye detect, face detect, and body detect. And it's doing a really good job. I mean, it's locking on people's eyes well, it's focusing on the animals well, we're getting good, accurate focus here. But there are still a couple things that, I wish would improve. So first off, when you're shooting animals, we get the nice little box around the eye. That's great. But when we're doing people and portraits, we're still getting the crosshair across the eye. And I really find that distracting. And I wish we could change that, but that's still the same way that all the other Panasonic cameras work. As well, from what I have been testing with just object detect tracking, just generic tracking autofocus, which I find very useful, it seems to be improved, but there's still situations where it'll just get kind of lost into the background. So I would like to see that improve as well. Sadly, our time in Tromso is coming to an end, and it's time to head back to Calgary. I realize there's still a lot of things that I want to talk about, that I want to test further on this camera. But when you see us again, we'll be in Calgary. There's still going to be snow, but there aren't going to be any reindeer. Hello, my friends. We're back in Calgary. We had a lovely time in Tromso, Norway, but the weather didn't quite cooperate. Still, we got some interesting stuff. It's always neat to see a new part of the world, and we had a really good time. But now that we're back, we've had a chance to do more testing, look at our samples, and finish some of our tests that we want to really do on the S1R Mark II. Also, Jordan, in the frozen delirium of Norway, did forget to mention some things, so I'm just going to fill those blanks in for him, as you'll see here shortly. But the first thing we want to talk about is autofocus performance. So this is what I will say. So first off, we got to keep in mind, this is still a pre-production camera. Firmware is not final. I would say that when it came to subject detection autofocus, things like animal detection on eyes or human face detection, for example, the camera actually did a really good job. It was consistent. I like the hit rate. You can see here famous Jordan running test in the winter time on subject eye detection. It actually tracked him very, very nicely, especially as he got closer to the camera and the actual face and eye detection kicked in. Now, when it comes to like zone focusing with subjects farther away, sometimes it was a little bit off. It was fairly consistent, but there'd be a few shots where it was off, for example. And also, I found that things like object tracking, which is not subject tracking, it's like just, being able to put a focusing point on a subject and have it track that throughout the area, that's still kind of willy-nilly. I mean, sometimes it works, but if you move the camera a little bit, it'll often just lose it and track onto something else completely different. Now, we did also find that the camera struggled sometimes to maintain proper focus in low light situations or areas with low contrast. And again, this is pre-production, so I kind of want to hold off until I test a full camera to really make definitive conclusions on that. It could also be a situation, just like we had that with like the S5 II, S5 IIX, where autofocus had some issues, but then firmware updates really corrected a lot of those. I mean, what I will say is that shooting on the street, subjects walking around, minimal action, the camera did a fine job. And frankly, this isn't really the kind of camera that I would pick up for heavy-duty sports and action. Now, Jordan actually had a very similar experience when it came to video autofocus. I mean, if a scene was really busy, low light situations, low contrast, sometimes, again, it would just lose the main subject. Even if we're playing with things like tracking sensitivity, making the autofocus lock onto a subject better, there's still times where it would just drift. And so hopefully we'll see these improve, but he said the experience was very similar to what he was used to on the S5 II, S5 IIX. Me standing still presenting a camera, no problem. Tracks any small movements I make really smoothly. But in more serious situations, it couldn't quite keep up. So we're going to keep an eye on that. And so 3 other observations that Jordan wanted me to pass on to you guys in terms of video. This camera indeed has false color, which is a very useful exposure tool. Fantastic to see that there. The S1R II does have a fan inside it, so don't worry about overheating. That's great. And third thing also, ProRes RAW does come with an APS-C crop, which is pretty heavy. Panasonic is working on other options, though. In the future, there will be updates to come. So all in all, I think Panasonic's done a really good job of their main goal, which was to make a high-end, powerful hybrid camera. I mean, on the video front, the S1R Mark II is actually very powerful. I mean, we are getting 8K record modes. We're getting oversampled high resolution to 60p. I would say it compares very favorably to the Nikon Z8. This is actually one of Jordan's favorite video cameras to use. Now, yes, the Nikon Z8 has a stacked sensor. This is still going to have slower readout speed, so rolling shutter is an issue, but Having the addition of a fan so it doesn't overheat, getting things like false color and really advanced exposure tools, I could absolutely see Jordan using the S1R II for a lot of our high-end work. Now, as far as photography goes, again, a very powerful camera. I do feel like people will appreciate the extra DR that you can get from using a non-stack sensor. And this is going to give it a slight advantage over cameras like the R5 Mark II and the Nikon Z8. And there's going to be a lot of people where that's more important than having fast electronic shutter shooting. Having the 9 frame per second mechanical shutter, because I still want to maintain that 14-bit DR, I think is fantastic for most shooting situations. But I wouldn't really use this for like high-end sports and action. I mean, electronic shutter mode is there when you do need the extra speed, but again, you are going to lose things like DR, rolling shutter being a problem, for example, not moving the camera too fast. But I really think this camera's got a lot of strength as a landscape camera, as a studio camera, as an art camera or street photography camera. And so I think there is absolutely a market to have a camera like this that gives you the high resolution, doesn't have a stacked sensor, but also keeps the cost significantly down from cameras like the R5 Mark II and the Nikon Z8. No matter how you look at it, the S1R Mark II is a very well-rounded camera. We were talking on the podcast before about what L-mount cameras need to do to really take over, and specifically what we want to see from Panasonic. And I think the S1R Mark II is a great step in the right direction. This is a hybrid camera, but I think photographers will get a lot of value and a lot of joy out of using a camera like this. So hopefully you guys enjoy this and it helps you decide if that S1R II is something that you would find interesting. It is a very powerful camera overall, so please leave your comments below and let us know what you think about this new product from Panasonic. And we're going to talk about it on the podcast, so you should definitely subscribe to that. You can listen to it on all your favorite podcasting apps, or you can watch it on this exact same channel as well. Think about getting a PetaPixel.com membership, $3 a month, $30 a year. You can then peruse PetaPixel.com ads-free, and there's fantastic bonuses. I mean, discounts on our merch store, sample galleries that only members can download to see the results from the products that we're testing. I think you'd really get a lot of value out of that, so definitely check it out. We really appreciate you guys joining us. Thanks so much. We'll see you soon with more on PetaPixel.